I was 80 years old when the HOA tried to steal my house, and they assumed, with the smugness only men in tailored suits can summon, that I'd quietly fold, too tired or too frail to resist. They thought I would sign whatever paper they shoved under my nose, nod sweetly, and vanish. They thought I was alone, and that was their first mistake. It began with a letter, not a knock at the door, not a meeting request, just a plain white envelope stuffed into my mailbox on a Tuesday morning. The paper was thick and too formal for ordinary neighborhood matters, and the language inside it was even stiffer. Violation of covenant, failure to comply, pending lien action. It read like a threat dressed in legalese. According to the HOA, the Homeowners Association of our quaint, manicured, sun-drenched community in Florida, I had failed to maintain my property according to their standards. The offences were listed in maddeningly vague terms: improper garden maintenance, unauthorized modifications, and non-compliant exterior features. That morning, I walked slowly around my house, the same house I'd lived in for 42 years, the one I had refinanced to pay for my husband's medical treatments before he passed, the one where my daughter learned to ride a bike, and where I'd baked thousands of cinnamon rolls from scratch for block parties and school fundraisers. The shutters were freshly painted, the lawn trimmed, the rose bushes pruned with care. I had even repaved the driveway the year before. There was no mess, no hazard, no eyesore. What there was, though, was me, a widow, older than most, with no husband to speak on my behalf, and no fear left in my bones. I called the number listed on the letter, hoping it was a clerical error, a wrong address, a bureaucratic hiccup. A woman answered, brisk, efficient, not unkind, but uninterested in empathy. Her voice had the brittle edge of someone who believed she held all the cards. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but the violations have been reviewed and confirmed by our compliance team. You've received 3 prior notices." I told her I'd never received anything before that letter. She sighed. "Unfortunately, we have documented delivery." I asked her what, exactly, I had done wrong. She said she wasn't authorized to interpret the citations, only to inform. And then came the real sting. "We will proceed with placing a lien on the property if the issue is not corrected within 15 business days." A lien. They wanted to attach debt to my home. My home. I hung up the phone with my hand trembling, not with fear, but with rage, clean and cold. I had lived through childbirth, through burying my husband, through cancer and surgery, and losing most of my hearing in one ear. I had shoveled snow off this porch in the 80s, braved hurricanes, and driven myself to the emergency room twice when no one answered the phone. And now, some 20-something on a headset, backed by a board of retirees turned despots who ran the HOA like a private kingdom, wanted to bully me out of the only place I had left. Not on my watch. The next morning, I pulled out a box from my closet marked Documents. I hadn't touched it in years. Inside was every major paper I had ever saved: the original deed to the house, tax records, my husband's VA benefits documentation, and more importantly, the original HOA bylaws from when the neighborhood had been established. My late husband had insisted we keep it all just in case, and I had teased him about being paranoid. That morning, I silently thanked him. I made coffee, sat at my kitchen table, and began reading. It took me nearly 3 hours to realize what they were doing. The HOA had amended the rules, quietly. Over the last 2 years, they had added dozens of new compliance regulations, mostly cosmetic, mostly arbitrary, and buried them in quarterly meeting minutes. If a homeowner didn't attend the meetings, and few did, they'd never notice until it was too late. Most people, when they got the first letter, paid the fine, or panicked, or left. That was the game. But they had made a critical mistake. They hadn't filed those amended rules with the county, and that, legally, was required. I needed someone to confirm what I was seeing. Someone with knowledge, not a favor from a friend, but an expert. I called my old friend Arthur, a retired judge who now taught part-time at the law school down in Sarasota. We hadn't spoken in a few years, but he picked up on the second ring and didn't even let me finish before he said, "Come down. Bring everything." I drove the hour and a half, with every document laid out in folders in the back seat, like a sacred archive. When I arrived, he laid it all out on his long walnut desk, adjusted his glasses, and began flipping. 10 minutes in, he sat back, eyebrows raised. "Lillian, what you've got here is not just a case. It's a disaster. For them." He walked me through it slowly. The HOA had levied fines without procedural compliance. They had failed to give documented notice in person or by certified mail, which was required by both their original charter and state law. They had skipped public ratification of amendments. And worst of all, they had filed preliminary lien paperwork with the wrong description of the property. My address was listed under another lot's parcel number. If they had succeeded, they wouldn't even have legally seized my house. They would have stolen the wrong one. Arthur leaned forward and said something I'll never forget. "If you want to fight this, you won't just win. You'll bury them." I stared at him, breath tight in my chest. "I don't want money," I said. "I want them to stop doing this to other people, to anyone." He smiled slowly. "Then let's make this public." And that was how it started. Not with fury, not with revenge, but with principle and love. Love for a life I had built brick by brick, with my hands, my years, my loss and memory. I wasn't going to let a board of opportunists rewrite the end of my story. They thought they were dealing with a tired old woman, but what they had really done was wake me up. By the end of that week, I had retained a lawyer, not a general practitioner or someone who dabbled in HOA disputes on the side, but a sharp, methodical litigator who had once built her reputation taking down entire condo boards for unlawful practices. Her name was Serena Castillo, and she came highly recommended by Arthur, who, after our first meeting, took a personal interest in my case. Not out of pity or nostalgia, but because he recognized what this really was. A systemic abuse wrapped in bureaucracy and paper trails, aimed directly at the people least able to fight back. Serena came to my house the following Monday, walked through every inch of the property, took meticulous notes and dozens of photographs, and then sat with me in the living room, her pen poised. "I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly," she said, her eyes calm but razor-focused. "Do you want to settle quietly, or do you want to take this to court?" I didn't hesitate. "I want to set it on fire, with facts." She smiled at that. "Then we do it my way." And we did. What followed was not a whirlwind, but a deliberate, strategic dismantling. We filed a formal cease and desist with the HOA's lawyer first, giving them a chance to retreat before litigation. It was ignored. I half expected that they still thought this was a bluff, or at worst, an annoyance. But I wasn't bluffing. I was preparing. Serena filed suit within 2 weeks. The complaint wasn't just about the lien attempt, it was comprehensive. It included claims of procedural negligence, failure to properly notify, fraudulent enforcement of non-filed bylaw changes, and most damning of all, the misuse of collected fines from homeowners over a 5-year period, which we had traced through public records and inconsistent financial filings. because while the HOA had hidden their rule changes in dense meeting notes, they'd been sloppy with their money. Arthur helped Serena comb through old financial summaries, which were publicly available through county transparency requirements, and what we found was staggering. Over $2 million collected in violations and fines, but no matching records of where that money went. No approved vendor payments, no maintenance work, no disbursements to the neighborhood itself. It wasn't just abuse of power, it was theft. And the board knew it. That was when things began to change. I received another letter, this time far more polite. They called it a misunderstanding and offered to rescind the lien and waive all fees and penalties as a gesture of goodwill. Serena nearly laughed when she read it. "They're offering crumbs," she said, "because they know the table is about to flip." We didn't respond. We had already filed discovery. And then the depositions began. One by one, the board members, men and women who had run our community like it was their personal fiefdom, sat under oath and stumbled through questions they hadn't prepared for. They couldn't explain the missing funds. They couldn't verify who had approved certain bylaw changes. They contradicted one another. One even broke down and admitted, on record, that they'd specifically targeted elderly residents because they usually just pay the fines without a fight. That sentence became the backbone of our case. Serena filed a motion to expand the suit into a class action, and suddenly it wasn't just me anymore. It was 17 other residents, most of them elderly, widowed, or without legal counsel, who had been fined, threatened, and in one case, evicted through fraudulent liens. The pattern was clear. The motive was profit. The evidence was overwhelming. I became the lead plaintiff. News spread fast. Local reporters picked it up first. Retired widow takes on HOA in $10 million lawsuit. Then regional stations followed. I gave one interview, filmed in my front yard with the roses blooming behind me, where I said the truth as plainly as I could. They thought I'd be easy to intimidate. They forgot I've spent my whole life doing hard things. Within days, HOA resignations began trickling in. 2 board members stepped down. A third stopped responding to subpoenas, but it was too late to hide. The paper trail existed, and every time they tried to minimize the damage, we uncovered more. A hidden slush fund, under-the-table vendor payments to companies owned by relatives, even a backdated rule change meant to push out a man in a wheelchair who had installed a ramp without permission. The judge fast-tracked the case after Serena filed a motion arguing irreparable harm to homeowners. Our court date was set for 6 months from the original filing. In the meantime, Serena negotiated injunctions that froze the HOA's ability to issue fines, collect dues, or enforce penalties. The machine ground to a halt, and for the first time in years, our neighborhood felt quiet again. Not the silence of fear, but of release. People began stopping me at the mailbox. Neighbors who had once barely waved now brought me cookies, asked for advice, shared stories of their own struggles with the board. One woman, eyes wet with gratitude, said, "You gave us back our dignity." I didn't know what to say to that. I hadn't started this to be noble. I had started because I was angry, because someone tried to take what was mine. But now I saw it clearly. It wasn't just about my house. It was about every person they thought they could scare. And I was going to make sure they remembered every one of us, not as victims, but as witnesses to their downfall. By the time spring bloomed across the neighborhood with its usual tidy perfection, trimmed hedges, fresh mulch, driveways pressure-washed by overpaid contractors, the HOA's grip had broken. Not entirely, not officially, but undeniably. The residents walked a little taller, held their gaze a little longer. The fear that had once settled over us like humidity had started to lift, and I could feel the shift every morning when I stepped out onto my porch and saw people I hadn't spoken to in years wave and smile, not out of politeness, but out of genuine relief. Still, the hardest part had not yet come. The lawsuit, with all its explosive headlines and class action heft, was only halfway done. The real work, the careful, painful, public dissection of every lie that had upheld their little empire, was underway, and it was slow, not because of lack of evidence, but because of just how much rot we found once we started looking. Every audit Serena's team ran turned up more. Funds redirected into shell companies owned by the treasurer's nephew, landscaping contracts awarded without bidding, then billed twice. A bank account opened under a false HOA subdivision name. And the worst, two separate homes that had been foreclosed on under fraudulent liens, now in the hands of investors with ties to the former board president. That wasn't mismanagement. That was racketeering. We filed an amended complaint. Now we weren't just asking for reimbursement of fines or reversal of liens. We were asking for treble damages, and we were aiming for $10 million. People told me I was brave. Some said I was crazy. A few even worried about retaliation, as if I hadn't already stared these people in the face and dared them to try again. But I wasn't afraid of them. I was afraid of what would happen if no one ever stood up. Because the truth was, I had been silent once too, for years after my husband died, when I let the neighborhood turn into something unrecognizable. I had watched the HOA slowly become less about keeping order and more about controlling narrative. They didn't just enforce rules. They made sure no one questioned the reasons behind them. They punished without transparency. They changed the tone of the community from collective care to petty tyranny, one letter at a time. I had kept my head down until they came for me. And when they did, they awoke something I hadn't felt in decades. That old resolve, honed in the classroom I once taught in the hospice where I said goodbye to the only man I ever loved, in the years I raised a child without help, in the nights I sat up after radiation treatments and told myself I would not let the darkness in. They didn't realize they were dealing with a woman who had already faced the worst and survived. The court date approached. Our list of plaintiffs had grown to 24, each with documented harm. Some had lost thousands to false fines. Others had suffered damage to their homes when the HOA refused to approve urgent repairs. One man, a retired Marine with early-stage dementia, had been threatened with eviction because his son parked in the driveway for more than the permitted number of hours. Their stories became mine. Not because I asked to carry them, but because I knew what it felt like to be dismissed, to be spoken over, to be underestimated. The courtroom was packed the day we began testimony. I sat on the front row in a blue blazer that had belonged to my late husband. It still smelled faintly of cedar and thyme, and watched as each board member was called to the stand. They stammered, they dodged, they denied. But the paper trail didn't lie. The judge, a woman in her 50s with a face carved from marble and eyes that missed nothing, listened without expression. But I watched her posture shift as the evidence mounted, as the contradictions piled up. As Serena, cool and precise, dismantled them one by one. When it was my turn to testify, I took a deep breath, adjusted the microphone, and spoke not as a victim, but as a witness. I described the letter, the tone, the threat. I described how they assumed I would not understand the law, how they expected I would not fight back. I spoke of the house, not its value, but its meaning, the memories it held, the years it cradled. They thought they were dealing with an old woman who didn't have the strength, I said, voice steady. But they forgot something important. When a woman has nothing left to lose, she becomes dangerous. There was no outburst, no applause, but the silence that followed felt like thunder. When court recessed that day, Serena leaned over and whispered, "That line's going to make the evening news." She wasn't wrong. It ran on every local station that night. Even a national outlet picked it up for a segment on HOA overreach. They showed footage of the courtroom sketch, my face drawn in careful lines, the judge's head tilted slightly, mid-listen. And then the settlement offer arrived. 10 million, not a cent less. It included full reimbursement of all fraudulent fines. It required the resignations of all current board members. It mandated an independent audit. And it provided legal assistance for any resident who wanted to contest past actions by the HOA. Most people would have celebrated, but I didn't feel triumphant. I felt vindicated, because it was never about the money. It was about the silence I broke, the pattern I interrupted, the house I kept, and the message I sent, not just to them, but to anyone watching. Never confuse age with weakness. Some of us have lived long enough to know exactly how to win. In the days that followed the settlement, my mailbox filled with letters from strangers, not just neighbors, but people from across the state, even a few from out of state. Some came handwritten on thick, cream-colored stationery, others typed and folded carefully into standard envelopes, each with different handwriting, different voices, but the same core message repeated in varying shades of grief and gratitude. Thank you for standing up. I didn't know we were allowed to fight back. One man wrote that his mother had lost her home to an HOA dispute in Arizona, another that he had paid nearly $20,000 over 5 years in non-compliance penalties and had never questioned a single one. The stories poured in, and I read each one slowly, sometimes twice, sitting at the same kitchen table where I had once read the letter that started it all. The place where I had first understood that what they tried to take from me wasn't just a house, but a sense of agency, and how many others had lived in fear of the same quiet theft. It should have felt like a conclusion, but it didn't. The settlement had been accepted, the money allocated, the resignations processed in hushed embarrassment, and the press cycle had already moved on to the next dramatic headline. But I wasn't finished, because while I had won the battle, the system itself remained largely intact. Not just here, in my sleepy Florida community, but everywhere this model of quiet exploitation continued to thrive behind polished gates and manicured lawns. The Attorney General's office reached out 2 weeks after the settlement was finalized. They requested an interview, informal at first, and then, after reviewing our case materials, formal statements. Serena and I met with 2 representatives in a small government building in Tallahassee, and I told them everything again. The original letter, the non-notices, the fabricated violations, the discovery of financial fraud, the others who had suffered in silence. I expected a nod, a handshake, a thank you for your time. Instead, they opened a case, a criminal one. Apparently, some of the misappropriated funds from our HOA had crossed over into a larger network of associations run by the same management company. What we thought was isolated mismanagement, a few corrupt board members playing at power, was actually part of a broader pattern. Misfiled funds, fake maintenance invoices, compliance inspectors who never visited the properties they cited, and a coordinated effort to fine, lien, and sell homes that had significant equity. Homes usually owned by older residents, often living alone, rarely with legal support. They asked if I would testify again, this time in front of a grand jury. I didn't even blink before answering. In the months that followed, I became something I never imagined I'd be in my 80s. Not a local curiosity, Not a retired schoolteacher living out her final years in a sunny cul-de-sac, but a witness, a legal participant. A voice called upon to explain how it happened, how it kept happening, and how no one stopped it until someone finally said, "Enough." Rachel, a neighbour's daughter, who had once waved shyly at me from her bike and now worked as a paralegal in the capital, stopped by one afternoon with a small bouquet of flowers and a note from her firm. She told me, with tears in her eyes, that she'd changed her area of focus. "I used to think HOA disputes were petty," she admitted. "Now I know they can ruin people, or save them." The irony wasn't lost on me, that what began as a single piece of folded paper slipped quietly into my mailbox with the arrogance of impunity had grown into a legal reckoning for an entire industry of concealed abuses. I never set out to be anyone's cause. I only wanted to keep my home. But as the weeks went on and I saw the ripples this case had created, I understood something that, even now, sits deep in my chest, like a truth I've always known. Sometimes the fight chooses you. And when it does, you have to decide if you'll look away or stand. Meanwhile, life in the neighbourhood settled into a new rhythm. A temporary committee had been appointed to restructure the HOA, this time overseen by an independent fiduciary. Elections were to be held in the fall, with a clear and public charter, monitored by a state-appointed advisor. Residents who once lived in fear of speaking up were now organising community meetings. Not in secret, not in fear, but openly. They brought snacks. They invited questions. People laughed again at those meetings. It felt like community, not governance. The house, my house, became something more too. Not a battleground, not a symbol, but a home again. The shutters were the same colour I had chosen 20 years ago. The roses bloomed in messy clusters, never quite symmetrical, but always vivid. The wind chimes my husband had hung on our 35th anniversary still clanged unevenly by the porch, their song off-key, but familiar. One afternoon, I stood in the garden as the sun began to lower across the street, and I watched a new family move into one of the homes that had once been seized under fraudulent lien. The woman, young, sharp-eyed, carrying a toddler on one hip, turned and waved at me as the movers brought boxes in through the open door. Her smile was real, grateful. Later that week, she came by with a plate of lemon bars and said, "I know what you did. We were on the waiting list for that house for years. They told us it wasn't available. And then suddenly, it was." I thanked her, took a lemon bar, and didn't say much else. I didn't need to. We both knew what had changed. Not just the names on the board or the rules in the binder, but the culture itself. The assumption that no one would fight, that no one could. I kept the settlement money, of course. That was never in question. I used some of it to quietly pay off the back taxes and outstanding medical debts of 3 other residents. People who had been too proud to ask for help, too worn down to push back. I didn't tell them. I just made sure it was done. The rest I placed into a foundation, small but focused, aimed at offering legal advice to low-income homeowners in HOA-regulated communities. I named it after my husband, who had always believed in fairness, even when life offered none in return. Some people asked why I didn't just sell the house and move somewhere quiet. But they didn't understand. This house was already quiet. Not because it was peaceful, but because it had been fought for. Every brick, every beam, every floorboard had been kept. Not inherited, not gifted, kept. And now, finally, I could sit in the living room, cup of tea in hand, and rest, not in surrender, but in peace, hard-earned, peace protected, peace I had built with nothing but documents, memory, and the sheer, unshakable will to be seen. By the time summer deepened its roots and the sidewalks shimmered in the heat, the transformation of the neighborhood had become impossible to ignore. The air no longer felt like it carried secrets. People spoke freely on porches, lingered longer during evening walks, and waved without the caution I remembered from years past. There was still an HOA, technically, but now it operated with transparency, under provisional oversight, and its tone had shifted from enforcement to service. Residents no longer whispered their complaints over fences. They voiced them, out loud, in community meetings where minutes were recorded, questions welcomed, and rules actually debated. And in that new stillness, that soft, post-storm clarity, I began to notice something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in over a year: safety. It wasn't just the kind that comes from knowing no one could take my house again. It was the safety of being known, of being recognized not just as someone who fought back, but as someone who had stayed, who had remained in place while others withdrew or folded or kept their heads down. I didn't wear that as pride. I wore it like armor that I had finally set down. I still got letters. A few more each week. Some from other homeowners still fighting their own battles, asking for advice, sending court filings, even handwritten copies of HOA notices they had received, as if I could divine an answer from the paper alone. Some came just to say thank you. One woman in Missouri wrote, "They took my parents home while my mother was in hospice. I didn't know what to do, but now I do. I'm going to fight." I sat with that letter for a long time. It never escaped me, not even in quiet moments, how many people had been silenced simply because they believed they were powerless. That was always the calculation these organizations relied on: the slow erosion of confidence, the death by paperwork, by language designed to confuse and overwhelm. They didn't need to kick down your door. They just needed to tire you into surrender. But I had shown them what happens when someone like me doesn't get tired. One morning, Arthur came by. He hadn't been by in weeks. He'd been busy consulting with the AG's office, offering quiet guidance as more associations across the state were flagged for investigation. He brought donuts and a thick envelope. "They're convening a statewide task force," he said as he sat at my kitchen table, where the sunlight filtered through the blinds like it always had. "They want you on it." I blinked. "Me?" He smiled. "You're already the face of it. Might as well have a seat at the table." I opened the envelope slowly. Inside were briefing notes, outlines for proposed reform, and a letter from the Department of Consumer Affairs. They wanted input from homeowners, especially those who had been through what they were calling adverse HOA actions. "I'm not a politician," I said, half to myself. "You don't have to be," Arthur replied. "You just have to keep telling the truth. And you're good at that." I wasn't sure, at first. I had never wanted to be part of any bureaucracy. I had spent my whole life raising children, teaching students, burying a husband, and tending to my home. I wasn't built for meetings and microphones. But something about the thought of sitting across from the kinds of men who once assumed I would quietly disappear, and doing so with authority, with lived truth in my voice and the law behind me, stirred something deep in my bones. Not anger, not even revenge, purpose. So I said yes. I traveled to Tallahassee twice that summer, once for the introductory session, and once for the first formal hearing. I wore navy both times, the same brooch my daughter gave me for my 70th birthday pinned carefully over my heart. I sat at the long oak table with 8 others, some in suits, some in sweatshirts, each with their own story of loss and resistance. We weren't legislators. We weren't lawyers. We were the evidence that these systems needed to be rewritten. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't give a speech. I told them about my porch, about the letter, about the silence that followed it, and about the day I decided not to be afraid. They asked questions. Some tried to minimize. Others were clearly moved. But none of them looked away. And when I finished, the room was quiet in that full way, the way a room gets when something important has just been said. After the hearing, one of the younger aides approached me, a woman no older than my granddaughter, and said, "You speak like someone who's been waiting a long time to be listened to." I smiled. I didn't wait. I worked. That evening, when I returned home, I stepped onto the porch and looked out across the street. The garden was in bloom. The roses, despite the heat, had held on. The wind chimes danced lightly in the breeze. Inside, the house smelled like lemon and rosemary, a candle burning on the windowsill, half a book waiting on the arm of the chair I always sat in after dinner. And I felt it again. Not pride, not peace, but something deeper, something still. The knowledge that everything I had endured had not gone to waste, that the battle I never asked for had become something bigger than a settlement or a headline. It had become a map for others, and I would carry it as long as I had breath. Not because I was fearless, but because I had learned what fear tried to teach me. That the moment you stop believing your voice matters is the moment someone else begins writing your story for you. And I had decided, once and for all, that mine would be written by my own hand. Autumn came with a quiet grace that reminded me of all the years I had lived in this house and the many versions of myself it had held. The newlywed painting walls with my husband while we laughed and bickered over colour choices. The young mother reading on the porch while keeping one eye on a tricycle wobbling down the sidewalk. The widow who sat at the kitchen table too long after dark because silence was easier than memory. And now this version of me, the woman who had gone to war over paper, principle, and place, and come out the other side still standing, still here. The air was cooler, lighter, the kind of breeze that lifts leaves from trees with gentle insistence. And I found that I no longer looked over my shoulder. I no longer checked the mailbox with dread. I no longer wondered what the board might do next, because there was no board. Not in the way there once had been. And more importantly, I was no longer the only one paying attention. The neighborhood had changed, not physically. The same hedges, the same porches, the same neat rows of stucco houses with matching shutters. But spiritually, the fear had gone out of the bones of this place. You could see it in the way people spoke more freely at gatherings, the way notices were now posted in full transparency, and how the new HOA elections, this time truly democratic and open to all residents, brought out a record turnout. And though I hadn't intended to run, I was nominated, unanimously. At first, I laughed. "I've had enough of legal drama to last the rest of my life," I told them. But they weren't asking for a bureaucrat. They wanted someone they trusted, someone they knew wouldn't look the other way, someone who had lived the consequences of what happens when no one's watching. I didn't campaign. I didn't print a single flyer. And yet I was elected by a margin that made the local paper write a follow-up column titled, "The Grandmother Who Rebuilt the Neighborhood." I didn't care for the term, but I understood what they meant. To them, I wasn't just Lillian anymore. I was the one who proved it was possible to speak, to fight, to win, even after everyone expected you to go quietly. As chair of the new board, my first act was to revise the bylaws, not erase, revise. Transparently, line by line, in open meetings that were recorded, transcribed, and made available to every homeowner. We eliminated predatory fine structures. We put limits on lean authority. We codified residents' rights to independent legal review before any enforcement action could be taken. And perhaps most importantly, we created a resident advocacy panel. 3 rotating members, unaffiliated with the board, elected solely to represent concerns and objections from the community. It was slow work, careful, and not everyone agreed with every change. But that was the point. There were no back doors anymore, no quiet power, no place for control that operated in shadows. One afternoon, I received a letter from the Department of Housing in Washington. I had been appointed, by recommendation of the state task force, to sit on a federal advisory council regarding HOA reform. Me, a retired schoolteacher from a sleepy Florida subdivision, was being asked to help shape the future of national housing policy. I read the letter twice. Then I set it down and wept. Not because I was proud, because I remembered. I remembered the first day I stood alone in my kitchen, shaking with anger, clutching that flimsy letter with its hollow threats and false authority. I remembered the loneliness, the doubt, the moment I wondered if maybe they were right. Maybe I was too old, too tired, too late. And now, here I was. Not just with my house intact, but with a voice louder and clearer than it had ever been. That winter, I travelled to DC for the first time in decades. The advisory council met in a modest but well-appointed conference room, and I was one of 12 at the table, a mix of lawyers, policy experts, former public officials, and, as one woman said with a smile when we introduced ourselves, the one we all read about. I didn't give speeches. I told stories. I told them what it was like to be told you were breaking rules you never knew existed, what it meant to fight for a home that held every piece of your life, what silence feels like when it's imposed, not chosen, and what it took to break that silence open. After the meeting, one of the younger members, a policy fellow with bright eyes and a notebook full of neatly drawn boxes, pulled me aside. "You make me believe we can actually change something," she said. "Not just argue about it?" I smiled. Arguing is easy. Changing things is just persistence, dressed up with paperwork. And I meant it, because I had lived it. Back home, the girls on my street, daughters of new neighbours, of old ones returning, of families that had watched all of this unfold, began stopping by after school. They brought cookies. They asked if I could help with history reports. One girl asked if she could interview me for her class assignment about someone brave in your community. I told her I wasn't brave. I was stubborn. She asked, "Is there a difference?" And I realized maybe there isn't. Not when it comes to standing your ground. Not when the ground you're standing on is your home, your name on the deed, your memories in every corner, your life stitched into the very wood and soil and light of the place they tried to take. And in those quiet evenings, with the sun setting through the blinds, a book on my lap, and the wind stirring the wind chimes outside, I understood something I hadn't known at the start. They never had power over me. They only had the illusion of it, for as long as I let them. But once I spoke, once I acted, once I refused to be erased, it was over. And now, the only thing left was to live, freely, fully, and without fear. As winter slowly receded and the first traces of early spring began to soften the edges of the neighborhood, the lawns regaining color, the breeze growing less sharp, and the trees along the sidewalk showing the tentative green of awakening leaves, I found myself returning to the rhythm of a quieter life, though it was a different quiet than before, one no longer defined by isolation or helplessness, but by resolution and clarity. The house, still the same in its bones, seemed to exhale with me as the seasons turned. as if it too understood that the siege had passed and that the ground beneath us was no longer shifting. Each morning I opened the windows, let in the air, and breathed in the scent of citrus and warm earth, no longer worried that a letter might arrive, that a stranger in a suit might try to tell me what I owed, what I lacked, or what I had violated. I brewed my coffee with steady hands and a steadier mind, walked the length of the garden with slow purpose, and took note of every new bloom, every inch of growth, not just in the soil, but in the way I stood inside the life that was now fully mine again. The community, once a landscape of fearful eyes and hushed door closings, had blossomed into something astonishingly cohesive, not through grand declarations or sudden transformation, but through the slow, intentional reweaving of relationships that had frayed under the pressure of the former HOA regime. I began to notice more than just the repairs and repainting. I saw neighbours who once only waved now gathering in each other's driveways, children playing on sidewalks without parents glancing over their shoulders every time a compliance vehicle crept by, and conversations that stretched past dusk on front porches where silence had once ruled. We held monthly meetings in the community centre, meetings that were no longer exercises in endurance or ceremony, but spaces of true dialogue, where homeowners, some of whom had been here as long as I had, and some who had only recently arrived, spoke openly about what they valued, what they hoped to see improve, and what they had learned from the ordeal we had all endured. And I, now chair of the reformed board, did not lead those meetings with authority, but with listening, something the old board had never mastered, and something I had come to believe was the true foundation of any community that hoped to last. One particular evening in early March, I stayed late after a meeting to speak with a young couple who had recently moved in with their infant daughter, nervous first-time homeowners with questions not about violations or dues, but about whether they were truly welcome in a neighbourhood with so much history and recent upheaval. I told them the truth, that what had happened here had not been the end of something, but the beginning of a better chapter, that their voices were wanted, and that they were stepping into a place not afraid of change anymore. Their eyes softened, and the young mother whispered, "We almost didn't buy here, but then we heard about you." That moment stayed with me for days, not because of pride, but because it confirmed what I had begun to understand. The fight, though never asked for, had not been in vain. The advisory council work continued as well, though I kept it contained to what I could realistically manage. I travelled less frequently now, preferring to provide written input or join video sessions from my study, which I had finally renovated after years of saying, "Someday." The walls, once bare and yellowing, were now a warm shade of sage, and I had lined the shelves with not just legal texts and policy documents, but framed photographs, the kind that held time rather than just images. My daughter as a child blowing out birthday candles, my husband in uniform on the front steps, and, in the centre, a recent photo of me with Rachel and her little sister on either side, the three of us smiling under the afternoon sun after one of our weekly walks. I had become, unexpectedly and perhaps unavoidably, a reference point. Not a hero, not a crusader, but a name people invoked when discussing the rights of homeowners, particularly those most often dismissed: the elderly, the disabled, the widowed. I received invitations to speak at community forums, to contribute to public commentary on pending legislation, and to provide testimony on reforms being introduced in state legislatures across the country. I chose carefully where to engage, never wanting to become a symbol stripped of specificity, because I knew the danger of being turned into a story rather than remaining a human being. The money from the settlement remained largely untouched, aside from what I had already given quietly to those who had been hurt most. I had no need for extravagance, no desire for larger space or shinier things. Instead, I set up a scholarship fund in my husband's name at the local community college, earmarked for students over 40 returning to school after loss, job displacement, or hardship. People who, like me, had been told too many times that their best years were behind them. That gesture, small and local, brought me more satisfaction than anything else the case had delivered, because it reminded me that the truest victories are not measured in press releases or dollar signs, but in the steady, private restoration of dignity, something the HOA had tried to strip not just from me, but from every person who had dared to ask, "Is this fair?" Now, at the end of each day, I sat on my porch, not to guard, not to wait, but simply to be. The wind moved through the chimes with a sound I had come to cherish, not because it was beautiful, but because it was familiar, unchanged through every version of my life that this house had witnessed. I no longer feared the mailbox. I no longer hesitated to open the front door. And I no longer doubted that I had earned, completely and without question, every square inch of ground beneath my feet. Because I had not just protected my home, I had reclaimed the very idea of what home meant, and I would never allow it to be taken again. As the first real heat of summer settled over the rooftops and the air took on that dense, shimmering weight it always did this time of year, I began to feel something I hadn't felt in what seemed like decades, a sense that my life was no longer framed by defense. The long months of legal tension, strategic patience, public scrutiny, and constant readiness had faded, not suddenly, but gently, like a distant storm that you're not sure when you stopped hearing. What remained was something much quieter, something rooted, a peace that had not been handed to me but earned, layer by layer, through every document read, every stand taken, every quiet refusal to be erased. The community, now firmly in the hands of a new board, one built not on hierarchy or exclusion, but transparency and shared responsibility, had entered into a rhythm that no longer required constant supervision. We had built something sustainable, not perfect, but honest. Issues were still raised, disagreements still occurred, as they do wherever people live side by side. But now they were handled in the open, with care, not behind closed doors, with whispered votes and unsigned letters. And I had begun, slowly, to let go of the reins, not out of weariness, but out of trust. I passed the chair position to a young mother named Celia, whose presence in our meetings had always been marked by her attentiveness, her clarity, and more than anything, her sincerity. She reminded me of myself at 35, sharp, measured, unwilling to be dismissed, yet not interested in attention. When she accepted the nomination, she looked to me, not for permission, but for reassurance. I offered it gladly. "I'll still be here," I told her, "just not always in the front row." And I meant it, because I had finally begun to understand that my role had changed. I was no longer the engine pulling everything forward. I was the foundation now, the memory beneath the movement, the quiet hand resting on the frame so others could build taller. And that realization was not a loss. It was a kind of grace. The foundation I'd created, the one in my husband's name, had begun offering its first round of grants. Small amounts, modest in scale, but life-changing in context. Help with legal consultations for elderly homeowners, assistance with tuition for adults returning to school after years of caregiving, stipends for people trying to reclaim homes lost to wrongful liens. The thank you letters we received weren't filled with dramatic flourishes or emotional theatrics. They were simple, clear, grateful. And in everyone, I recognized the voice of someone who had, like me, found themselves standing at the edge of something unfair, not knowing whether they had the right to push back. I visited one of those recipients, a woman named Ruth, just 2 towns over, who had used her grant to hire a lawyer to fight an HOA that had fined her for having a non-standard mailbox installed after her original one was destroyed in a storm. They'd threatened her with escalating penalties, a lien, and even foreclosure, all over a box of wood and metal that met every postal code requirement. Ruth, in her late 70s, had never hired an attorney before in her life. She had lived in that home for over 40 years. "I didn't want to cause trouble," she told me, standing in the shade of her porch. "But I also didn't want to be pushed out of the place where I raised my children." I looked at her worn hands and clear eyes, and thought, this is who they count on staying silent. This is why we speak. The lawsuit was dismissed within 2 weeks of the lawyer's first letter, and Ruth sent me a photo of her mailbox, just a plain wooden box with a brass flag, and wrote underneath it, "Still standing." I printed that photo and taped it to the inside of my kitchen cabinet door, next to my grocery list. A reminder, not of the fight, but of the staying. And at home, life had taken on its new shape. The evenings were slower now. I cooked more deliberately, tried new recipes, read thick books I'd always told myself I would get to someday. I began walking in the early hours before the sun had fully risen, when the neighborhood was still hushed, the sidewalks cool beneath my sneakers, the birds just beginning to mark their territories. During those walks, I often thought about everything that had unfolded in the past 2 years, how close I'd come to losing everything, and how, in that near loss, I had gained something far more enduring. Not just clarity, but courage. Because courage, I had learned, doesn't announce itself with fanfare. It comes in the form of stubbornness, in the act of getting up the next morning, in rereading a contract line by line when your eyes are burning, in saying no again, even when your voice shakes, and in realizing that you are never truly alone, not if you choose not to be. The young girls down the street still visited. Sometimes they brought flowers. Sometimes they just came to sit on the porch and listen. One of them asked if I'd write a book someday. I laughed, said I didn't know where to begin. She said, "Start with the letter, and then tell them what you did next. Maybe someday I will. But for now, I am content to live the chapters as they come, quietly, completely, and with the unshakable knowledge that I am still here, not as a cautionary tale, not as a symbol, but as a woman who refused to leave. And in that refusal, I found not just justice, but something even more precious. A life no one else gets to define but me. By the time late summer leaned into the edge of fall and the first orange leaves began to litter the sidewalks, I had settled into a rhythm of living that was no longer governed by reaction or recovery. My days unfolded with an ease I had once believed impossible to regain, and though the memory of what had happened, the injustice, the resistance, the long legal climb, still sat quietly in the corners of my mind, it no longer held weight over me. Instead, it lived there like a scar, no longer tender, but impossible to forget. There was a moment, one unremarkable at first glance, that made this shift especially clear to me. I had stepped out to fetch the mail, a simple act that, not too long ago, would have come with a tightness in my chest, a flutter of dread as I reached into the box, afraid of what envelope might be waiting. But that day, as the late sun poured across my driveway and the breeze tugged at the hem of my skirt, I reached inside without thought, without fear. And when I found only a catalogue and a neighbour's misdelivered postcard, I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because the absence of anxiety felt like a small, private miracle. That moment, though no one saw it but me, felt like a closing chapter. The foundation, now with nearly a year of operations behind it, had expanded. Serena, my attorney, who had become something closer to a friend than a professional ally, had joined the board, offering her legal knowledge to shape the program into something more strategic. We hired a part-time coordinator, a young woman named Emily, who had grown up watching her grandparents lose their home to a predatory lending scheme. Her energy was tireless, her vision sharp, and she took to the work not as a job, but as a calling. She reminded me of what I must have once looked like to others when I was young, and certain that the world could be made fairer if only enough of us stayed awake to it. The foundation began offering small community workshops, not just on HOA rights, but on financial literacy, property law basics, and how to read the fine print that so many of us are taught to ignore. They were held in local libraries and community centres, and occasionally I attended, sitting in the back, letting the younger voices lead, only raising my hand if someone asked for a story, for a real example of what all this meant. I never dramatized it. I simply told the truth. The letter, the silence, the decision not to move, the day I realized I wasn't afraid anymore. And people listened, not because I shouted, but because I didn't need to. One afternoon, as I returned from one of these sessions, I found a small package on my porch. Inside was a bound volume, not thick, no more than 50 pages, and a note written in careful script. It was from a woman in Colorado who had attended one of our online sessions. She had compiled her own story, from the first violation notice she received to the letter she sent back, quoting the very same clause I had used in my own defense. At the end, she had written, "Because you stood, I knew I could too." I placed the booklet on the shelf in my study, beside my husband's old law books and my granddaughter's finger-painted cards, and stood there for a long moment, taking in the quiet truth that nothing we do in defense of dignity ever stops with us. It moves, often invisibly, through time and distance, landing in the hands of strangers who may never meet us, but who feel, in our defiance, a mirror of their own potential. The neighborhood itself had become, in small but tangible ways, a better place. Not perfect, no community ever is, but open, flexible, awake. The new board met monthly, with rotating leadership and full transparency. Dues were modest, decisions collaborative. We funded a scholarship for a local student interested in community planning. We hosted our first neighborhood picnic in years, where people lingered well past sunset, children running between tables, the smell of grilled corn and peach cobbler filling the air. I sat beneath the same old tree near the sidewalk and watched it all unfold with the quiet joy of someone witnessing something not just repaired, but reimagined. Tom, the former board president, the man whose name I hadn't spoken aloud in over a year, never reached out after the settlement. I saw his name once in an article about a failed consulting venture tied to yet another homeowners association. I didn't follow the story. I didn't need to. I had no desire for vengeance, no interest in his undoing. My story was not about him anymore, if it ever had been. It was about what we reclaimed when we refused to be small. I had once believed that strength came from grand gestures, lawsuits, headlines, public statements. And while those things had their place, I had come to understand that real strength lived in persistence, in showing up every day and refusing to retreat into bitterness or exhaustion. It was the strength of standing in your garden even after someone tries to tear it out by the root. It was the strength of learning a law you never meant to know, of writing a letter in language not meant for you and sending it anyway. It was the strength of saying, "No, I will not go quietly. I will not go at all." And as the year began its slow descent into the cooler evenings of early autumn, I sat again on my porch, wrapped in a shawl my daughter had once knitted, a cup of tea resting beside me, and felt, for the first time in many long years, completely, quietly, and without compromise, at home. Not just within these walls, but within myself. Because in refusing to be moved, I had become immovable. And that, in the end, was the greatest victory of all. The last leaves of the year began their slow descent across the lawn, painting the sidewalks in soft shades of gold and rust, as if the world itself were signaling not an end, but a gentle transition, a season giving way to another, a life continuing its course after a storm long weathered. It was in that air, heavy with memory and soft light, that I felt most fully the truth of everything that had unfolded. What had begun with a single, quietly menacing letter, the kind printed without soul, signed with a title rather than a name, had turned into something much larger, something enduring. And now, as I sat in the same home they had once tried to take from me, I realized that I had not simply protected a place. I had rewritten the story that was meant to silence me. In the weeks after I stepped back from leadership, the neighborhood remained active. Celia proved to be a thoughtful and balanced chairwoman, confident in her decisions, but open to input in a way that reminded people what true leadership looks like. I became an informal advisor, the one people called when they wanted context, not control. And that suited me fine. I no longer needed to speak to be heard. My presence was enough. The foundation had grown beyond anything I'd imagined in those early weeks, when it had existed as nothing more than a conversation between Arthur and me over coffee, both of us unsure if anyone would care, or if it would all be too little, too late. And yet, a year and a half later, it had funded over 50 legal consultations, provided 8 full grants to residents across 4 states, and begun partnering with housing advocates to push for structural change in HOA governance at the state level. It had become, in ways both quiet and profound, a force. Not because it was large, but because it was focused. It knew who it was fighting for. I still received letters, fewer now, but each one still felt like a thread pulling gently from the same fabric. Some wrote simply to say they had stood up, had asked questions, had found the courage to say no. Others sent updates, documents, the outcomes of their own small courtroom victories. There was a rhythm to it, as though across the country, in neighborhoods not unlike mine, people were beginning to see that they didn't have to fold, that silence was not their only option. I kept all those letters in a wooden box in the corner of my study, the same box where I had once stored Ellen's school drawings, old postcards from my husband. And now, the photocopy of that original HOA notice, creased and stained from the number of times I had handled it. I kept it not as a trophy, but as a reminder that it had started here, that this fight, with all its twists and all its moments of doubt, had been real, and that I had won not by shouting louder, but by never backing down. There was one more thing I did that fall, something I had been thinking about for months. I wrote my story. Not a memoir, not a speech, not a dramatic retelling meant for shelves or television, but a letter. 12 pages. Typed slowly, over the course of 3 evenings, with long pauses between paragraphs as I weighed every sentence. I wrote it for my granddaughter. Not because I thought she would need it right away, but because someday she might. Someday, she might be told she is not enough, not smart enough, not young enough, not loud enough. Someday, someone may try to push her to the edges of her own life and ask her to step aside quietly. And when that happens, I want her to have something in her hands that tells her, without doubt, that she comes from women who did not leave when they were told to, that she is the legacy not of meekness, but of endurance. I sealed the letter, wrote her name on the envelope, and placed it in the box beside the others. And I knew that, whether she read it at 16 or 60, it would reach her when it was meant to. As winter approached and the nights grew longer, I found joy in the smallest things. The steam from my tea curling toward the cold window, the creak of the porch swing as I settled into it, the laughter of children 2 houses down who had no idea that the quiet woman on the corner had once fought a legal war for the ground they now played on. I was not a symbol to them. I was a neighbor. And that, in the end, was all I had ever wanted to be. Not a cautionary tale, not a news headline, not the woman who sued for $10 million and won. Just someone who stayed, who saw what was coming and stood in its path, not because she sought victory, but because she refused surrender. Who proved that being old does not mean being powerless, that a soft voice does not mean a weak one, that a single house, when held with enough memory, enough purpose, enough love, can become unmovable, and that no one, no matter how official their title or how crisp their letterhead, gets to decide who belongs here. Because I belong here. I always did, and I always will.